What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and if you're watching this on the day it releases, I am likely traveling to Dallas, Texas for the DreamHack Team Invitational. So today we're going to do something a little bit different so I can have a video to release during my trip. This is a topic that's actually been requested several times by members of the community. So I want to talk about a comparison between different weapon keywords in 10th edition Warhammer 40k. I'm going to do this in the format of YouTube's favorite video style, the tier list. Now, this tier list is a little performative because I don't think that all of the weapon keywords in 40k are directly comparable, but I do think that the statistical comparison and the comparison of value between many of them is still worth the discussion. Is lethal hits better than sustained hits, or is devastating wounds superior? All those questions are what we're going to be talking about today. So let's dive into this silly tier list, and first off, I'm going to fill out this bottom category that I've created. These are the weird keywords. These are keywords like extra attacks, pistol, and blast. These essentially change how the weapon operates, and they stop it from using the normal weapon rules, and act as more of a side grade than an actual benefit. It's hard to compare them with the other keywords, so we're basically going to put them in their own category. That doesn't mean they're bad, just means that they're different. Extra attack weapons, for example, get to be made in addition to your normal melee weapon attacks, but with the downside that you can never increase their attack volume, so they don't work with a lot of synergies that you would normally be able to use. Pistols give you the opportunity to fire them in melee and ignore firing into melee penalties, but can only be fired by themselves with some exceptions. And blast weapons give you additional shots against large units, but cannot be fired themselves into melee. So while they do give you tangible benefits, they also come with some drawbacks, which means that they end up with that kind of side grade. Hazardous is always so an easy one to put in here. It's just a debuff to the weapon. It just makes the weapon worse. It gives you a chance to kill you, so that's the worst one on the list. All these other ones on the list are, for the most part, strict upgrades. We don't want Hazardous on your weapon if you can help it. So from there, we'll start comparing some weapon keywords that can change how you can attack. Assault is the first one, for example, and I think I'm going to put this one up here in A tier. It allows you to advance and fire your weapons, and in Leviathan games comes with the additional benefit that as long as you are eligible to fire your weapon, you can perform actions. Whether that continues on into the next season where they have a new action mechanic, I have no idea, so this could be outdated in just a couple of weeks here, but for now, assault weapons both make you good at finding angles to shoot enemies at, extending your weapon's threat ranges, and performing actions with utility units. It is just an all-around good keyword to have. A similar one is going to be indirect fire, and we're going to put that up in S tier. Now, the downside of indirect fire weapons is a little bit of a meta game issue. Indirect fire does give you some debuffs when it shoots at units that it can't see, but also units with indirect fire weapons tend to cost a lot, but we're just comparing the effect of the keyword right now, not necessarily the units that it's on. And I think it's a good indicator that this is a very powerful keyword because they tend to upcharge all the guns that have indirect fire. Being able to shoot at your opponent without your opponent either being able to shoot back at you because you're hiding behind buildings, or you can shoot at their units that would normally be protected, can change your opponent's entire game plan. Just having indirect fire weapons in your army means a lot of their units that might have roamed the board independently now have to go into transports, start in strategic reserve, or just generally play less efficiently, and that's a super big buff. Now, on the flip side, we have heavy. Heavy gives you bonuses when you remain stationary, but the downside is that remaining stationary is actually not a thing that you do very often in 40k. 40k is a game about movement. You're moving to objectives. You're moving to complete secondaries. You're moving to get to range. You're moving out of threat range. You're falling back out of combat. Almost every model on a 40k table is moving basically every turn, which means that the heavy keyword very rarely comes into play. On top of that, even the situations where you wouldn't move, like you're disembarking transport or coming out of reserve, the heavy keyword doesn't apply, so it's not actually that useful. The times that you'll most often see it is when a vehicle has a heavy weapon and gets locked in combat, and some datasheets are specifically designed to take advantage of it. Units that are particularly inexpensive or tanky and can move out into line of sight and survive return fire can make use of the heavy keyword, but those are few and far between, and take a very specific set of statistics to make the keyword work. Can be a bonus to have, but as a keyword itself, though, it doesn't actually come up into play that often. Next up, I'll cover these two bonuses, Rapid Fire and Melta. These are kind of the same effect in a lot of ways, and I'm going to put them solidly in B tier here. They're going to be towards the lower end of the spectrum because they both are contingent on your weapons being in short range, which is not unlikely in 40k, especially 10th edition with the Leviathan missions tends to be a kind of a knife fight of a game. Your armies are pretty close to each other. You're oftentimes moving up the table in order to complete your secondaries and contest enemies on objectives. So getting into Melta range and getting into rapid fire range are not the hardest thing in the world, but having the damage of your weapon be contingent on being close to your opponent means that it does have some counterplay. It is possible to out deploy or maneuver around your ability to move into rapid fire or into Melta range. So in both those cases, it gives your opponent the ability to outmaneuver you. I will say that Melta does have a little bit of additional bonus, especially against enemies that have damage reduction effects. Things like Catan shards that half incoming damage because of the way that damage bonuses are calculated actually do not have the bonus Melta damage from the Melta keyword. So there are some instances where Melta weapons actually become a very powerful sort of metagame solution to things. So we will put Melta a little bit above rapid fire, but I'm going to put both of them in this B tier. Next up, we're going to cover these three keywords right down here. I've split the anti-keyword into anti-infantry and anti-heavy, or anti-monster and vehicle, mostly for my own sanity. You can be anti-anything, but the more flavorfully inspired anti-keywords I'm not going to be talking about on this tier list. I don't think it's worth going down every instance of anti-psych or anti-chaos, anti-tyrannid, for example. These are the two most common instances of this effect. Oftentimes we'll see anti-monster and vehicle come packaged together, but that is not always the case. A lot of times, especially things like haywire weapons or EMP weapons are going to be anti-vehicle but not anti-monster, and some poison stuff is anti-monster but not anti-vehicle. I'm going to be treating those kind of simultaneously because they appear together so often, but also they're mostly just anti-big high toughness stuff. And to be honest, that's pretty good. We're going to put that somewhere around the high B, low A tier because these are high toughness enemies that you really want to be wounding more successfully on. Anti-infantry, however, typically only affects you against low toughness enemies, so we're going to put that over here. Meaning that anti-infantry is maybe equivalent to +1 to wound in some instances, but oftentimes is only there to trigger other keywords. And in those cases, it can be good when combined with things like devastating wounds, but on its own, oftentimes it feels kind of superfluous. Anti-monster and anti-vehicle, though, can oftentimes bring you from wounding on 5s or 6s down to 4s or 5s, for example, or even better in some instances. And in those cases, it is an absolute godsend. Now, the last one in this sort of subcategory we're going to talk about is Lance. I'm going to put Lance above all of these other anti-effects because it is just a +1 to wound bonus. It doesn't matter what keywords your target has, you are going to be getting +1 to wound. Now, it is conditional. It requires you to be a melee weapon and you to have charged in that turn, but I would say that the majority of combat in 40k, in which units are actually trying to kill each other, happens on the turn that people charge. It's very rare that there's meaningful combat that lasts more than a couple phases. And in many cases, units that have access to Lance also have the ability to fall back and charge, at least in some form or in some sort of stratagem. Unless you're a very specific type of unit that is meant to absorb charges, and there are not too many of those in the game currently, Lance is just going to be a huge benefit to you in melee. And again, it doesn't matter what your target's toughness is, unless your strength is astronomical and you're attacking low toughness infantry, for example. Now, I think kind of an additional entry into this little subcategory here might be precision. This one's a little bit weird, and it changes how your wound allocation works, but it doesn't actually give you any benefits to wound. I'm going to put precision towards the bottom of the list here, though. Precision is generally not very useful, especially if you have it as a core ability on a weapon and you're not getting it actively from some sort of stratagem or special effect. When you can gain precision proactively by using Epic Challenge or a stratagem in a very specific situation in which precision is useful, it is a nice tool in the toolbox to be able to pull out if you're in circumstances where you can use precision to kill characters, especially ones that are giving you additional bonuses, but that doesn't happen too often. And there are tons of counterplay and weird idiosyncrasies with this rule that kind of unnaturally make it worse. For example, precision attacks require line of sight to the target character in order for you to assign wounds to them, even if you're in melee. A style of attack that does not normally require line of sight when targeting, precision doesn't care about that. Precision always requires that you have line of sight to the character that you want to put wounds on. This means that your opponent can very easily defeat it by just putting that character behind line of sight blocking terrain and stringing the unit back to them, and that will prevent you from epic challenging them, that will prevent you from hitting them with sniper weapons. That just makes them entirely immune to precision. You have to kill through the unit to then kill the character with overkill damage, which, to be honest, in most cases you could just do anyway, so most of the time you don't actually need the precision keyword. On top of that, giving yourself precision to attack characters in melee isn't even a particularly good piece of technology to knock out their leadership effects. Because of the rules commentary, leadership effects are persistent until the end of the attack activation that has precisioned the character. So if, for example, you go in with a character leading a big badass melee unit and you try to epic duel an enemy that is giving the target unit a powerful defensive buff, -1 to be wounded, for example, and you precision that character out, that -1 to wound leadership effect will still be in play until all of your guys have attacked. So your big badass melee unit will still be affected by it, even if you've chosen your character to fight first. While I won't say precision's entirely useless, I would certainly not include it as a core part of my game plan in almost any situation. I would just keep it in mind for the situations where I can use it, and I would never go out of my way to put weapons in my army that specifically have precision. All right, as we're moving down the line here, we've got some significantly spicier keywords to talk about. So I'm going to talk about these last three. These all essentially impact different stages of the attack sequence. Torrent makes you automatically hit. Twin Linked gives you wound rerolls, and Ignore Cover basically debuffs your opponent's armor save by getting rid of their cover bonus. But I'm going to put Torrent at the top of S tier. Obviously, from a meta-textual standpoint, the Torrent weapons tend to be kind of underpowered, partially because of the strength of the Torrent keyword. If you were to put Torrent on long-range weapons that were high impact, for example, it would be utterly disastrous. It would be broken as hell, which is why most Torrent weapons have to be 12 inches or maybe, on a really good day, 18 inches in range. That's also why you find that most of the time you can buff the output of Torrent weapons. Things get absolutely insane, and that oftentimes becomes the mainstay of whatever list you're constructing. On a baseline, if you're looking at a unit or a weapon profile that, let's say, has a ballistic skill of 3 on most of its weapons, adding the Torrent keyword onto that weapon is an immediate 33% boost in damage. You will get 33% additional wound rolls that can then convert into damage by automatically hitting with Torrent versus just rolling a 3+ ballistic skill. That's essentially in the running for the biggest increase in damage from any single one of these keywords. On top of that, Torrent also makes you extremely good at Overwatch because you no longer have to make a hit roll, you just automatically roll a hit, which means that Torrent weapons have some additional usefulness in your opponent's turn over and above the additional damage that they're dealing in your own turn. And that, kind of like Indirect Fire, which is another reason that they're sort of at the top of the list here, can entirely change how your opponent plays the game. If you have a strong Torrent weapon, they have to play around it. They have to move around the sides, they have to continuously get into line of sight, think about cover during your turn, or even, in some cases, just be unable to profitably charge into your army. Access to a good Torrent weapon, especially on a strong platform, the Land Raider Redeemer I'm talking about, can basically entirely change how a whole faction plays. Now, there is a little bit of anti-synergy once we start talking about these critical hit effects. Torrent doesn't make a hit roll, so it can't roll critical hits, which means that things like sustained hits or lethal hits have no synergy with Torrent whatsoever. Although, that is a small price to pay for all of your attacks automatically hitting all the time. Now, once you have successfully hit your target, we then take into account Twin Linked, and I'm also going to put that up here towards S tier. Twin Linked gives you wound rerolls, which is a good bonus. If you have critical wound effects, especially things like devastating wounds, Twin Linked can go absolutely nuts. And if you're already automatically hitting, so you have like a Twin Linked Torrent, for example, that's just the spice right there. But rerolling your wound rolls is always good. I don't know what else to say about this. Rerolls be good, I guess. I don't know. Next up, we have Ignore Cover, and I'm going to put Ignore Cover over here up near Assault and Lance. While it is incredibly strong, and I do think that it deserves a place up here, sort of near these S tier keywords, it doesn't universally apply, and in some instances, it doesn't really help you statistically that much. Ignoring Cover, though, in 10th edition, especially against large units and units with high base armor saves, can can be essentially equivalent to +1 AP, which is already a pretty solid increase in damage. It has less of an impact against low saving throw enemies or enemies that are already out in the open. Oftentimes, the place I find ignore cover being the most impactful are against high toughness, vehicles and things, not only because they have a high chance of being in cover because of how 10th edition's cover rules work, but also giving you a greater chance to convert the high impact weapons that you're shooting into them is a big deal. All that being the case though, I think you're never going to be upset that you have ignore cover, even in the instances where you're not making use of it. A lot of times it just represents, a small, marginal, but appreciable increase in damage. Now, last but certainly not least, let's talk about these three, which are probably the most comparable three keywords in the game right now. These are kind of the triumvirate of critical effects. Devastating Wounds ignores target saves on critical wounds, Sustained Hits gives you additional hits on critical hits, and Lethal Hits automatically wound on critical hits as well. This means Sustained Hits and Lethal Hits are the most comparable, and they are very close. Essentially, Sustained Hits giving you double critical hits is either better if your baseline profile is very strong in and of itself, or you're targeting enemies that you have an easy time wounding. The math breaks out that against sort of high toughness enemies, Lethal Hits is actually mathematically slightly superior if you are wounding your target on 5s or higher, but as soon as you introduce any other effects into that arithmetic, it gets a little bit confused. For example, Lethal Hits has like active anti-synergy with Devastating Wounds. A lethal hit doesn't make a wound roll, so you can never get a critical wound. And if you have anything else that triggers on critical wounds, that will also not trigger if you're firing your lethal hit weapon, if you have achieved a lethal hit. Twin Linked also changes that math as well, so if you have any wound bonuses, like Twin Linked or like Lance, that can make it so that lethal hits are only mathematically better if you're wounding on a base roll of a 6 up, which, while good, is limited in its usefulness. Sustained Hits, on the other hand, if you're sustained 1, and it is variable, so you could potentially be getting extra bonuses on Sustained, which does, I guess, make the keyword a little bit more flexible and probably make it a little bit better by itself. Sustained Hits is always going to be useful. Regardless of what the target you're attacking is, unlike Lethal Hits, it never has any anti-synergy with your critical wound effects or any wound bonuses that you have, and it is always going to be a passive damage increase. Each pip of Sustained mathematically works out to somewhere around +1 to hit, and that gets even better if you are already quote-unquote hitting on 2s or better. Sustained 1 with a 3+ weapon skill, for example, basically means that you're hitting on 2s. Sustained 2 on that same 3+ basically means that you should convert all of your hit rolls into wound rolls. As soon as you get hit re-rolls on either of these cases, they almost double in their effectiveness, especially because if you need to, you can fish for those effects. Now, for its flexibility, I am going to put Sustained Hits just above Lethal Hits. Lethal Hits definitely gets a little bit of a kick back, thanks to the fact that it does have some anti-synergy with some other keywords, and also because in many instances it's actually not very useful. There's also kind of a trend of these effects being mutually exclusive. A lot of times you'll have to choose between character attachments that either give you lethal hits or sustained hits, or you choose between weapons that either have lethal hits or sustained hits, for example, and sustained hits, generally speaking, is a little bit more useful. Lethal hits definitely not bad, especially if you have low impact weapons that you're firing at high toughness targets, and just getting additional wounds on those is always good, but it definitely doesn't feel quite as excited when you're shooting like a Skyray gunship at something and gaining lethal hits on your strength 14 twin linked weapon. Now, last but certainly not least in this category is Devastating Wounds. Devastating Wounds is certainly a whole can of worms. On release, it was the dumbest keyword, and I probably would have put it maybe first, maybe next to Indirect Fire, I'm not entirely sure, because it converted all its damage into mortal wounds, so you could Devastating Wounds with one attack and kill multiple models. Fortunately, if you're playing in the current format using the data slate update, you can no longer do that. It just ignores your target saves on a critical wound. Ignoring saves is basically always good. It sort of functions as a little bit of a poor man's ignore cover, but it also punches through invulnerable saving throws. So it doesn't matter what your target has. If it's not a feel no pain, the Devastating Wounds is going to hit it. That can mean that Devastating Wound weapons are always a little bit scary for high save characteristic targets. And while there are some instances in which your AP is too high and the Devastating Wounds doesn't really do anything because your target saves aren't that good, those are relatively few and far between. Devastating Wounds also has some very nice synergy with other keywords. Twin Linked especially, or any sort of wound rerolls on Devastating Wound weapons, gives you extra chances to trigger your Devastating Wounds. Similarly, Sustained Hits gives you additional hits, which then could trigger Devastating Wounds, but Lethal Hits and Devastating Wounds, again, like I mentioned before, has anti-synergy. A lethal hit cannot trigger Devastating Wounds, meaning that you actually don't want a lethal hit if you're going into hive save characteristic targets. If you have any sort of additional bonus to that wound roll, especially reroll rerolls or something, the lethal hits are actually in many cases worse for you. Regardless, especially if you're attacking high value enemy targets, in 10th edition, it is very unlikely that your weapons will punch through all of your opponent's defensive characteristics, especially since oftentimes units are in cover, affected by AP reduction effects like Armor of Contempt, or simply just have good invulnerable saves. And Devastating Wounds, ignoring all of that, is a huge deal. There is some weirdness with how Devastating Wounds is applied. It's kind of a holdover of when the mechanic inflicted mortal wounds, but Devastating Wounds always apply at the end of an attack sequence, which means that all of your normal damage that didn't roll critical wounds applies first. In some cases, this can actually mean that the Devastating Wounds gets applied really inconsistently and kind of annoyingly overkills your target, but there are some ways that you can use this to your benefit. For example, if you're attacking a bodyguard unit that has mediocre defensive stats themselves, but strong defensive stats on their attached character, you can kill the unit with your normal damage and then apply all the Devastating Wounds to the character that, for example, let's say has a 2+ invulnerable save. Killing all of their bodyguards with your regular attacks before inflicting all your Devastating Wounds directly to their dome definitely gives the keyword some additional usefulness in weird corner cases that you might not have considered before. So anyway, that's my tier list of weapon keywords in 10th edition 40k. I thought this was kind of an interesting video. So let me know down in the comment section what you think about this tier list and if you like this style of content. As always, thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video, and huge thanks to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.